cruel invitation. The night was unusually quiet in the city. Sundar Pichai sat alone in his office, the glow of the desk lamp spilling over scattered notes, papers, and his open laptop. He had just finished another long day filled with back-to-back meetings, presentations, and decisions that carried the weight of thousands of employees' futures. For most people, being the CEO of one of the world's most powerful companies would be the highest point of their life. But for Sundar, tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in his chest that no achievement could erase. The past weeks had been filled with subtle whispers, jokes passed around in corridors, and glances that lasted a second too long. He was respected by millions outside, admired by aspiring engineers across the world, but inside the very walls of the company he helped build, there were still a few who saw him as an outsider. They mocked his accent, his quiet voice, and his humble background, never realizing that it was those very qualities that shaped the leader he had become. Earlier that day, a group of younger executives had approached him with what looked like enthusiasm. They told him about an upcoming corporate talent show, a tradition where employees came together to showcase hidden skills. It was meant to be lighthearted fun, a way to build unity outside the boardroom. But as they spoke, Sundar noticed the smirks tugging at the corners of their mouths. One of them, a tall man with a sharp suit and sharper tongue, leaned closer and said, "You should join too, Sundar. I bet everyone would love to see you sing." His tone carried more amusement than respect. Laughter broke out among the group. It seemed harmless on the surface, but Sundar knew better. They didn't see him as someone who could command a stage. They expected him to stumble, to embarrass himself, to confirm the joke they were already writing in their minds. That night, in his office, Sundar thought about their words. Sing. It had been years since he had done anything like that. Back in his small hometown in India, before the pressures of Silicon Valley and the demands of leadership, he used to sing with his mother in the evenings. She would hum old melodies while cooking, and he, a shy boy with dreams too big for his pocket, would join softly, afraid the neighbors might hear. Those memories were buried deep beneath the layers of corporate responsibility, but they came rushing back now, warm and sharp all at once. He realized that the invitation wasn't really about talent. It was a test, a cruel trick disguised as camaraderie. But Sundar had always believed in facing challenges head-on. If life had taught him anything, it was that moments of humiliation could either break you or build you. As the days moved closer to the event, word spread like wildfire through the company. Whispers turned into chatter, and soon everyone knew the CEO himself would be performing. Employees debated in hushed tones whether he would actually go through with it. Some doubted he would show up, others joked about what song he might attempt. A few felt a pang of pity, imagining the embarrassment of a man so powerful being reduced to laughter on stage. The very idea seemed surreal. Sundar Pichai, the man who addressed world leaders, standing under a spotlight, microphone in hand, not delivering a keynote speech but trying to sing in front of his employees. Sundar, however, remained calm. He went about his work with the same quiet focus, making no mention of the upcoming night. But deep inside he was preparing. Not in the way most expected. There were no singing lessons, no rehearsals with a coach. Instead, he revisited his past. He pulled out old recordings his mother had once sent him, her voice tender and filled with warmth. He played them softly at night in his office, letting the tunes remind him of who he was before titles and wealth. He knew he would never be a polished singer, but that wasn't the point. This wasn't about perfection. It was about courage, humility, and showing his people that leadership was not about pride but about vulnerability. The night of the show finally arrived. The auditorium was buzzing with energy. Rows of chairs were filled with employees, managers, and even some board members. The stage was decorated simply, with bright lights and a single microphone standing in the center. Laughter echoed through the space as people shared snacks, clapped for earlier performers, and speculated about what was to come. Behind the curtain, Sundar waited quietly, his hands clasped together. He could hear the MC building anticipation. And now, the voice boomed with excitement, the moment you've all been waiting for, our very own CEO, Sundar Pichai. The room erupted with cheers, But not all were genuine. Some clapped politely, others shouted with mock enthusiasm, and a few whispered jokes to their colleagues. Sundar stepped onto the stage slowly, his figure calm, his face composed. The bright lights hit him, and for a moment he squinted, his eyes adjusting to the sea of faces staring back at him. He picked up the microphone and a hush fell over the room. He cleared his throat, his soft voice carrying through the speakers. "Good evening," he began, his tone steady but gentle. "I know some of you might be surprised to see me here. I was invited to sing tonight, and while I am not a professional, I decided to accept. Not because I am confident, but because I believe sometimes it is important to do the things that scare us." The room grew quieter. People leaned in, expecting him to stumble, perhaps to laugh nervously and walk away. But Sundar stood tall, the faintest smile on his lips as if he knew something they didn't. Then he began. The first note was soft, almost fragile, like a whisper carried by the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. His voice trembled, slightly, but as he continued, something shifted. The melody grew stronger and his tone steadier. He sang not to impress, but to remember, to honor the boy he once was, the evenings with his mother and the courage it took to stand there now. Every word seemed to carry weight, each note filled with sincerity. The laughter that had been ready to burst from the audience faded, replaced by silence. People leaned forward, stunned by the raw emotion in his voice. And just when the room was beginning to sink into his song, when hearts were softening and eyes were fixed on him, something unexpected happened. One of the younger executives in the front row, the very man who had first suggested the idea as a joke, pulled out his phone. He began recording, smirking, ready to capture what he thought would be the CEO's downfall. But as the camera rolled, his smirk slowly faded. The voice he was capturing wasn't laughable, it was moving, haunting even. The executive lowered his phone slightly, unsure if what he had planned would backfire. The song neared its chorus, Sundar's voice rising with more strength than anyone thought he had. His eyes closed. He poured his heart into the performance, forgetting the audience, forgetting the ridicule. He was no longer a CEO on a stage. He was a son singing with his mother in a small kitchen far away. Then, just as the last line of the chorus echoed across the hall, Sundar's voice cracked. It was small, almost imperceptible, but enough for the silence to break. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Someone stifled a laugh in the back. The executive with the phone smirked again, thinking the moment had finally arrived. Sundar opened his eyes, the lights blinding him, the pressure pressing down like a weight on his chest. For the first time that night, he felt the doubt creeping, and would he finish strong or would he crumble under the stares of hundreds? The answer hung in the air as the entire room waited, breath held, hearts uncertain, wondering if the man who led a tech empire would falter in a simple song. The crack in his voice, the auditorium was still. Sundar stood in the center of the stage, the microphone close to his lips, the heat of the lights pressing against his skin. He had been doing well, his voice carrying softly yet with surprising depth. But then came that fragile crack, a tremble in the middle of a note that exposed his humanity to everyone watching. The sound hung in the air like shattered glass, delicate and impossible to ignore. For a few seconds, the silence of the room was broken only by small whispers and muffled chuckles, the kind that pierced deeper than open laughter. Sundar heard them, every single one, though he tried to keep his focus forward. The smirk on the young executive's face widened again as he adjusted the phone in his hand, convinced the moment had turned in his favor. This was what he had wanted. A flaw, a mistake, something that could later be replayed and ridiculed. Sundar could almost feel the man's satisfaction from across the room, and for the first time that night, doubt pressed against him like a heavy tide. He could step back, give a polite smile, and leave the stage. People would understand. They would excuse it, perhaps even forget it in a few days. But deep inside, Sundar knew walking away now would mean something greater. It would mean letting others decide who he was, His fingers tightened around the microphone. He closed his eyes again, shutting out the faces before him, shutting out the whispers, shutting out the mocking grin in the front row. He returned to the memory of his mother's kitchen, the faint aroma of spices in the air, her gentle voice, humming beside him as she stirred the pot on the stove. He remembered how she used to pause, tilt her head and smile when his young voice cracked, telling him, "It's not the sound that matters, my son. It's the feeling you put into it." Taking a deep breath, Sundar began again. The room quieted instantly. The audience leaned forward, some expecting another stumble, others curious to see if he would fight through it. His voice, though still imperfect, carried more strength now. He wasn't singing for perfection. He was singing for truth. And something strange began to happen. Those who had come prepared to laugh found themselves slowly disarmed. The notes weren't flawless, but they were filled with raw honesty. And honesty has a way of reaching places that polish cannot. By the time he reached the next verse, the murmurs had faded. Phones that were raised to record lowered. Not because people didn't want to capture the moment, but because they realized it was no longer a joke. What had started as a setup for humiliation was turning into something unexpected, something powerful. Some employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing their own complicity and waiting for him to fail. The auditorium, which had moments before been filled with restless energy, now felt like a sacred space where each note touched something unspoken in the hearts of those listening. But not everyone surrendered so easily. A group of younger staff in the back row exchanged glances, whispering harshly, their laughter sharp in the otherwise quiet hall. One of them even muttered loud enough for a few nearby to hear. He should stick to spreadsheets, not singing. The words carried across the room, and Sundar caught them. For a heartbeat, his voice faltered again, not from weakness but from the sting of cruelty. He had faced criticism in boardrooms, rejection in negotiations. But this was different. This was personal. And then something remarkable happened. Before Sundar could even respond with his song, a voice from the side of the stage spoke out. It was an older janitor who had been quietly sweeping the back corridors before wandering in to watch. He wasn't part of the corporate hierarchy. He wasn't dressed in expensive suits, but he had the courage others lacked. "Let the man sing," the janitor said, his voice carrying through the hush. "You all wanted a show, didn't you? Well, here it is, and it's better than any of you expected." The audience turned, startled. Whispers rippled again, but this time different. There was no mockery in the janitor's tone. It was protective, almost defiant. Sundar heard it, and for the first time that night he felt something stronger than doubt rise inside him. Resilience. He pressed forward with the song, his voice now steadier, richer, as though the simple words of a janitor had built a bridge beneath his feet. He sang the chorus, again this time louder. The crack was still there in his tone, the vulnerability still present. But instead of weakening him, it made the song more real. Some in the audience found their eyes wet without knowing why. Music has a way of bypassing the walls people build around themselves, and Sundar's song, with all its imperfections, slipped through the cracks of pride and cynicism. And then, just as he seemed to be winning them over, just as the song reached a tender moment, the young executive in the front row did something no one expected. Frustrated that the performance was shifting in Sundar's favor, he deliberately coughed loudly, mocking the rhythm, hoping to throw him off again. A few people snickered at the disruption. Sundar's voice wavered for a second as he heard it, his eyes opening to meet the executive's smug stare. For a moment, the whole auditorium froze, waiting. Would Sundar break under the weight of it all? Would he lose the fragile connection he had built with the crowd? Sundar took another deep breath, steadied himself, and then, the unexpected reply. Sundar stood frozen for a moment, the microphone in his hand trembling slightly as the sound of the deliberate cough echoed through the auditorium. It was not just a cough, and everyone knew it. It was a challenge, a dismissal, a way of saying you don't belong here. The young executive's smirk grew wider as he leaned back in his chair, certain that he had regained control of the room. A few others chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. The balance of the night seemed to hang on the thread of Sundar's next move. Would he falter? Would he give them the satisfaction of defeat? But Sundar did something no one predicted. He stopped singing. He lowered the microphone slightly and looked straight at the executive, his expression calm, almost gentle, but his eyes carried something deeper, disappointment, not anger. The silence grew heavier. Sundar let it linger before speaking softly into the microphone, his voice steady enough to carry across the auditorium. "You know," he said, "when I was a child, I often cracked my voice while singing. My neighbors would sometimes laugh. I thought it meant I wasn't good enough. But my mother told me something I'll never forget. She said, 'Music isn't about being flawless, it's about being real.'" The room shifted. People leaned forward, captivated not by his singing now, but by his words. He wasn't scolding, he wasn't defensive. He was telling a story, his story. "Tonight," Sundar continued, his gaze never leaving the executive, "I know some of you expected me to fail, maybe even wanted me to. And that's okay, because failure is part of life. But what I learned long ago is that sometimes the cracks in our voices are what make the song beautiful. They remind us we are human." The executive's smirk faltered for the first time. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware that hundreds of eyes were now watching him instead of Sundar. Some employees who had been ready to laugh at Sundar moments ago now found themselves glaring at the executive, realizing the cruelty of his actions. Then Sundar lifted the microphone again and said, "So let me start again, not to prove anything, but to simply share something I love." And with that, he began the song once more. This time from the very beginning, his voice was not polished, but it carried something far more powerful: conviction. The cracks were still there, the trembles in certain notes remained, but instead of weakening him, they became the very thing that held the audience. Each imperfection reminded them that he wasn't performing as a CEO trying to impress, but as a man daring to be vulnerable in front of his own people. The auditorium grew quiet again, but this silence was different from before. It was reverent. Even those who had laughed earlier now found themselves unable to look away. A few employees lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier thoughts. Others felt their chests tighten with a strange kind of admiration. Sundar's courage was speaking louder than his voice ever could. As the song reached its middle verses, something subtle yet powerful began to happen. Scattered claps started, first from the back rows where a group of junior employees sat. It was hesitant, unsure, but it grew. Others joined in, clapping softly in rhythm, not to mock but to encourage. Soon the sound spread across the room, a wave of support building with each beat. Sundar's voice rose above the clapping, shaky, but stronger now, carried by the collective energy of people who had gone from skeptics to believers. The executive in the front row clenched his jaw, clearly unsettled. This was not the humiliation he had planned. He shifted in his seat, his phone still in hand, but this time he didn't raise it. It was as if even he knew the narrative was slipping beyond his control. Sundar, however, didn't look at him again. He didn't need to. He was too lost in the music, in the memory of his mother's smile, in the unexpected rhythm of clapping hands lifting him higher than he imagined possible. But just as the moment seemed to be transforming into triumph, a new tension entered the room. The executive leaned forward to the colleague beside him and whispered something sharp, almost venomous. The colleague smirked and quickly pulled out his phone, typing with a speed that made Sundar's supporters uneasy. Whispers spread through the front rows as people saw messages being sent, notifications lighting up across devices. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Was the executive planning something more? Sundar reached the end of the verse, his eyes closed, his voice filled with raw honesty, unaware of the whispers growing around him. The audience, however, could sense a shift in the air. The support was still there, the admiration still strong, but now it was layered with tension, an expectation that something was about to happen, something that might threaten to undo the fragile magic he had created. The song was building toward its chorus again, the part where his voice had cracked before. The audience held their breath, waiting to see if he would overcome it this time. Sundar inhaled deeply, steadying himself, and opened his mouth to sing the line that had broken him earlier. But before the note could fully leave his lips, the large screen behind him meant for stage visuals, suddenly flickered on. The crowd gasped. The sabotage, the audience gasped as the giant screen behind Sundar flickered to life. It had been dark for most of the show, used earlier only for background patterns and soft lighting effects, but now it glowed harsh and bright. The sudden change pulled everyone's eyes away from Sundar, breaking the fragile connection he had worked so hard to build. Confusion rippled through the crowd as images appeared. Grainy photos of Sundar from years ago. Not polished corporate portraits, but awkward, candid shots from his early days in Silicon Valley. Some showed him wearing worn-out clothes, his hair unkempt, looking shy and uncertain at small community events. One photo even showed him standing nervously at a microphone during a graduate seminar, clearly uncomfortable, his posture hunched. The auditorium erupted with scattered laughter and murmurs. People glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh fully or stay silent. The intention was clear. The screen was being used to mock him, to remind everyone that beneath the polished title of CEO was once a timid immigrant student who didn't fit the mold of power. Sundar turned slowly, his song caught in his throat as he faced the screen. His heart pounded, not because of the images themselves. He had lived those moments, he remembered them well, but because he understood what this was. Someone was trying to steal the stage, to humiliate him publicly, to undo everything he had built in that vulnerable performance. And though he didn't turn to look, he knew exactly who was behind it. In the front row, the young executive leaned back with satisfaction, his lips curled into a smug smile. Beside him, his colleague tapped, on the phone again, clearly in control of the projection. The cruelty of it struck like a blade. These weren't strangers mocking him online, these were his own people, people within the walls of his company, choosing to attack the man who led them. For a moment, Sundar felt the weight of the spotlight shift against him, harsher and colder than before. The clapping that had lifted him minutes earlier had stopped. The air in the auditorium was heavy with tension, divided between those who found the display amusing and those who sat frozen, ashamed but unsure how to react. His throat tightened. He could stop here, walk away, let the sabotage consume the night. No one would blame him. But deep inside, Sundar knew that the next few seconds mattered more than any decision he had made in a boardroom. This wasn't about music, and it wasn't even about dignity. It was about showing everyone, both the ones who respected him and the ones who doubted, that resilience meant refusing to bow when the world tried to shame you. He lowered the microphone for a moment and looked at the screen again. He studied the old photos one after another, as if he were seeing them not with embarrassment but with acceptance. Then, in the same calm voice he used in meetings, he said into the microphone, "Yes, that was me. That is me. Those pictures are not an insult. They are a reminder." The auditorium fell silent. The laughter died quickly, replaced by curiosity. Sundar continued, his voice steady, carrying emotion but not bitterness. "I came here years ago with almost nothing. I was nervous, shy, often unsure of myself. Those were hard years. I wore the same shirt too many times, I stumbled when I spoke, and yes, I looked awkward, standing at microphones. But every one of those moments shaped me into the man standing here today." His words echoed through the hall, cutting through, the tension like a blade through fog. The audience shifted uneasily, realizing the power in what he was saying. Sundar took a deep breath and then, without hesitation, began to sing again, this time with the old photos still glowing behind him. He didn't ask for them to be removed. He didn't try to hide them. Instead, he let them stand as part of his story. The effect was electric. The audience, who moments earlier had been on the verge of laughing at him, now watched with wide eyes as his voice rose above the images. The cracked notes, the trembling tone. It all blended with the pictures of his past, creating something raw and unforgettable. It was no longer just a performance, it was a confession, a story told through both voice and image. Slowly, the room began to change again. The murmurs of mockery faded, replaced by a heavy silence. People weren't laughing anymore. Some were leaning forward, tears forming in their eyes, realizing they were witnessing something rare. A leader willing to stand unashamed in his imperfections, daring to be vulnerable in a way few ever dared. The young executive's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected this. He had wanted humiliation, but instead he had created the backdrop for a moment of transformation. Yet pride wouldn't let him stop. He whispered to his colleague again, and suddenly the slideshow changed. This time it wasn't just awkward photos. It was screenshots, old news articles, blogs, and forums where anonymous voices had once criticized Sundar, calling him too soft, too quiet, too unfit for leadership. The words appeared in bold letters across the screen. He'll never last as a leader. A follower, not a pioneer. Too weak to handle power. Gasps rippled through the room. This was harsher than photos. This was an attempt to dig into scars, to replay insults that had once followed him in his climb to the top. Sundar felt the sting as he read them, the old doubts clawing their way back into his heart. He had worked years to silence those voices, to prove them wrong. But now here they were again, larger than life, projected for his entire company to see. His voice faltered as he tried to continue the song. For the first time since stepping on stage, he nearly broke completely. The audience shifted uncomfortably, many now angry at the cruelty of what they were witnessing. But no one moved. They waited, breath held, to see if he would withstand the storm or if the humiliation would finally consume him. Sundar gripped the microphone tighter, his knuckles white. The words on the screen blurred before his eyes as his chest rose and fell heavily. This was the breaking point. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, her words about music being real, about courage being found in cracks, and then something unexpected stirred in the crowd. A voice from the back, trembling but clear, began to hum along with the tune he had been singing. It was a young intern, her face pale but her courage bright as she carried the melody softly, almost like a prayer. Heads turned toward her, surprised, but she didn't stop. Soon another voice joined in, then another, until the hum grew into a chorus. The sabotage was still flashing behind him, but the sound of his people, those who chose to stand with him, was growing louder. Sundar raised the microphone again, his eyes wet, but his expression firm. He took a deep breath, ready to push through the storm. Not alone this time, but with voices beside him. And just as he was about to begin the chorus again, the auditorium doors swung open at the back with a loud creak, and someone unexpected walked in. The voice from the door, the creak of the auditorium doors cut through the humming chorus like a blade. Every head turned, the voices faltering for a moment as a tall, graceful figure stepped into the room. It was an elderly woman, her hair silver but her posture proud, her presence commanding attention even without saying a word. For Sundar, the sight of her made his heart stop, his throat tightened, his eyes blurred because he recognized her instantly. It was his old music teacher from India, Mrs. Anandi, a woman he hadn't seen in decades. She had once been the first person outside his family to encourage his voice. Back then, in the small town where Sundar grew up, she had volunteered at the school, teaching children not just music but confidence. She used to tell him, "Your voice is not weak, Sundar. It is soft, but soft things can still carry great strength if they come from the heart." When he left India for his studies, they had lost touch. But now, as if fate had chosen this exact moment, she was here. Gasps filled the auditorium as she walked slowly toward the stage. No one knew who she was, but her aura demanded silence. Sundar's heart raced as he watched her approach. He wondered if she had seen the cruel images behind him, the mocking words, the smirks in the front row. He wondered if she had come to witness his humiliation, but when her eyes met his, all he saw was the same calm kindness she had carried years ago. She stopped just a few feet from the stage, and without asking permission, she spoke, her voice strong despite her age. "When I first taught this boy to sing many years ago, people laughed at him. They said his voice was too fragile, too plain. But I told him that music isn't about showing off. It's about reaching people here," she said, placing her hand over her heart. The audience froze. The weight of her words seemed to cut through every layer of mockery and pride that had filled the room earlier. Sundar felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them back, refusing to let them fall yet. The young executive in the front row shifted, uncomfortably, his plan unraveling faster than he could contain it. He muttered something under his breath, but this time, no one laughed with him. The authority of the old woman, the tenderness in her voice, and the sheer coincidence of her arrival made even the most cynical employees hesitate. Mrs. Anandi then turned toward Sundar and nodded. "Sing, my boy," she said softly. "Sing not for them, not even for me. Sing for yourself. Sing for the little boy who was once afraid." The humming in the back began again, softer this time, but steady. Sundar lifted the microphone with shaking hands, his heart pounding louder than the applause had earlier. This time, his voice came out with a power he hadn't known he carried. It was not flawless. There were still cracks, still trembles, but the tone had changed. It was raw, filled with a courage born of years of struggle, of being underestimated, of carrying the quiet strength of resilience. The screen behind him still showed cruel words, but no one was paying attention to it anymore. The audience was locked on Sundar, their faces softened, their eyes wide. Some leaned forward, unable to look away. Others closed their eyes, letting his voice wash over them. Then, as the chorus swelled, something extraordinary happened. The janitor who had spoken up earlier put down his broom, stepped toward the side of the stage, and began clapping to the rhythm. His clap was firm, deliberate, echoing across the silent hall. Within seconds, others joined. First the interns, then middle managers, then whole sections of employees. The auditorium filled with clapping hands and humming voices, merging with Sundar's song. The executive in the front row clenched his fists, his face red with frustration. His plan had failed spectacularly. The more he tried to humiliate Sundar, the more the man rose above it, and the more the people rallied around him. The executive whispered harshly to his colleague again, but this time no one cared. They were irrelevant now. The center of the room belonged entirely to Sundar. Mrs. Anandi stood quietly at the edge, her eyes glistening with pride as she watched her former student transform. Sundar's song carried the hall in a way no polished performance could have. It was messy, vulnerable, but it was alive. And when he reached the final line of the chorus, the entire room rose to its feet, clapping, humming, some even singing softly with him. But just as the applause erupted, just as Sundar felt the warmth of his people rising around him, the screen behind him flickered again. This time it wasn't old photos or cruel words. It was a live projection from the young executive's phone camera. The feed showed Sundar himself on stage, but edited cruelly in real time with filters and distortions, designed to make him look foolish. Laughter threatened to break out again as a distorted version of his face appeared behind him, exaggerated and ugly. The audience hesitated, caught between their rising admiration and the jarring, humiliating projection. Sundar turned, slowly, his breath catching in his chest. This new sabotage was sharper, crueler, and inescapable. He had fought through cracks in his voice, through old scars, through cruel words. But now, would he be able to withstand being mocked in real time, turned into a caricature in front of his own company? The applause faltered. The humming stopped. All eyes turned back to Sundar, waiting. And in that moment, Sundar took a deep breath, gripped the microphone tighter, and stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on the projection. The cruel projection loomed behind Sundar, filling the vast screen with distorted images of his own face. The young executive had gone too far this time. The filters warped his features, stretched his mouth grotesquely, and exaggerated his every movement as though he were a clown performing for ridicule. Laughter trembled at the edges of the crowd. Some employees bit their lips to keep from chuckling. Others shifted uneasily, ashamed but afraid to speak. The auditorium, which had moments before been filled with admiration and clapping, now teetered on the edge of cruelty again. Sundar felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. The humiliation was sharp, piercing deeper than anything before. He had fought through cracks in his voice, through scars of his past, through cruel words projected on the screen. But this was different. This was mockery unfolding in real time, engineered to break him completely. For a brief second he considered stepping down, handing the microphone back, walking away with whatever dignity he still carried. It would have been easy. No one would blame him. They might even pity him. But Sundar remembered something his mother had once told him on a night when he had come home crying, after being mocked for his accent at school. She had taken his hands and said softly, "The world will always find ways to laugh at you, but you must decide whether you let their laughter define you or you let your truth rise above it." Those words struck him like lightning now. He stood taller, his grip on the microphone tightening, his eyes fixed not on the cruel projection but on the audience before him. With a calmness that silenced even the faint laughter, he spoke. "Look at that screen," Sundar said, his voice steady. "Some of you may laugh. Some of you may feel uncomfortable. But what you see up there is not me. It is only a distortion. And isn't that how life works? People will always try to distort you, to twist your image, to make you smaller than you are. But the truth..." He paused, letting the silence grow thick. "The truth cannot be mocked." The auditorium fell silent. Even the executive, who had been whispering instructions to his colleague, froze in his seat. Sundar turned back to the audience and raised his voice, stronger now, louder than any moment before. "I stand here as the same man in those old photos. I stand here as the boy who cracked his voice. I stand here as the immigrant who was told he didn't belong. And tonight, I stand here as your CEO. Not because I am flawless, but because I never stopped standing. Even when people tried to laugh me down, the room shook with a tension that could not be broken by mockery anymore." Sundar then did something no one expected. He turned toward the cruel projection behind him and began to sing again. He sang directly to the distorted image of himself, his voice raw, cracking, imperfect, but filled with a defiance so pure it carried like fire through the auditorium. At first, the distorted projection looked ridiculous, the filters still twisting his features. But as his song grew louder, something shifted in the audience. They stopped seeing the distortion and started hearing the truth in his voice. They saw the courage in his posture, the vulnerability in his cracked notes, the authenticity that no filter could erase. Slowly, one by one, people rose to their feet. First it was the janitor by the side of the stage, clapping his hands firmly. Then the young intern who had hummed earlier stood, tears streaming down her face. Managers rose, engineers rose, entire rows rose together. The auditorium filled with the thunder of applause, stronger, louder, more powerful than anything the cruel projection could command. The young executive's face turned pale. His phone slipped in his sweaty hands. He tried to stop the feed, but by then, it didn't matter. The distortion was meaningless, swallowed whole by the roar of admiration filling the hall. Mrs. Anandi, standing near the edge of the stage, wiped her eyes as she watched her former student claim his moment. Sundar's song ended not with perfection, not with a polished note, but with silence. His voice trailing off into the applause, his head lowered in humility. When he looked up, the entire room was standing. It was not polite applause. It was a standing ovation, fierce and unrelenting. A recognition not of flawless talent, but of unbreakable courage. The executive who had orchestrated the sabotage shrank in his chair, his smirk gone, his power dissolved. Employees who had once laughed at Sundar now glared at the man, their loyalty visibly shifting. The humiliation he had planned for Sundar had only revealed his own cruelty. Sundar placed the microphone back on its stand. He didn't bow. He didn't raise his hands in triumph. He simply stood quietly, his face calm, his eyes glistening with emotion. He knew this wasn't about winning against mockery. It was about showing what leadership really meant. That true strength lies in embracing vulnerability, in daring to be human. When the ovation finally slowed, Sundar stepped forward and said softly, "Thank you." Tonight was never about singing. It was about reminding ourselves that we are more than the voices that try to pull us down. We are more than the distortions people create of us. We are, all of us, enough. The audience erupted once more, their claps echoing like thunder. Their cheers shaking the walls. Sundar stepped off the stage slowly, his shoulders heavy but his heart lighter than it had been in years. The janitor caught his eye and gave him a proud nod. The intern smiled through her tears. Mrs. Anandi placed her hand over her heart, the gesture saying more than words ever could. And for Sundar, that night would never be forgotten. He had walked into the auditorium expecting mockery, and he had left with something no distortion, no cruel word, no sabotage could ever erase. Respect, not just as a CEO, but as a man who dared to be vulnerable and found strength in the cracks of his voice.